Runs with Courage, Chapter 2, Arrival. 3 suns later, the Whites came again in their wagon. This time I knew why they had come. They had come to take me away. A different man and woman were in the wagon this time, but they were dressed the same as the other Whites. The man wore hard-pointed foot coverings, and his hair was cut short. The woman wore a long black dress and a matching headdress that ended in small pieces of ribbon at her chin. They waited near the wagon as I gathered my things from our teepee. Father and Uncle stood outside with Bear, but Mother was inside with me. "For you," Mother said, placing a small wota in my hand. It was attached to a leather cord. I looked inside the pouch to see small bits of sage and a tiny piece of buffalo fur. "To keep you protected," she said, "and to help you remember to use your lightning helpers for strength and not anger." "Thank you," I said, swallowing back tears. I slipped the wota over my head and stepped outside on legs that felt stiff and hard like pieces of wood. "Here, sister," Bear said, handing me a small carved rabbit. "I made this for you." Father was teaching Bear to carve. The wooden rabbit was missing an ear and only had one leg, but Bear's eyes shone with pride as he handed it to me. "It's perfect," I said, squeezing his shoulder. He smiled happily. I turned to face the wagon. "Mother," I said softly. "Courage, daughter," she said, touching my face with her palm, letting it linger. Father and Uncle stood tall, and I tried to gather courage from their strength. Brother stood between them, bouncing from foot to foot. The other cousins had left to play. I was sure he wanted to join them. Mother held me close, then turned away quickly so I would not see her tears in her eyes. I was helped into the back of the wagon by the white man. The white woman began to talk, throwing out words I could not understand. I turned away from her so I could not see the Whites, but I could watch the teepee instead. With a lurch, the wagon pulled away. "Sister! Sister!" Bear suddenly cried, trying to break free, but Uncle held his shoulders firmly. I made my face like stone, trying not to show my brother my fear. I had never ridden in a wagon before, and I found it strange to sit on a large piece of wood that was moving. The wood was vibrating from the wheel's movement, and I could feel my heart beating along fearfully. As the wagon traveled, my teepee shrank to a small speck and finally disappeared completely. I could no longer hold back the tears. I let them fall down my face. We rode through the prairie grasses as if the horse were following a path only it could see. The sun had slowly begun to move down the sky, and I watched the grasses sway in the wind as the light dimmed. The women had stopped trying to talk to me long before, and I turned to the front of the wagon. I listened to the man and the woman talk back and forth with their white words. The words were short, as if a bird's wings had been clipped and it could no longer fly properly. They did not flow into the other words as ours did. In the fading light, I could barely see the outline of the bluffs in the distance that were near our Teo Spa. Instinctively, I looked up to find the pole star. It appeared in the sky, shining light of familiarity, and I watched it as we traveled. Uncle had told me stories of this star. It was the only star that stayed in one place in the night sky, and it could help someone find their way if they were lost. Darkness continued to deepen, and I could no longer see shapes in the land. Other stars had begun to appear, twinkling from high above. In the distance, I could see tiny specks of light that looked like stars, but I knew they were not. They were too close to the ground, and did not flicker as real stars did. For a moment, my fear was replaced with curiosity. As I studied the lights, they grew larger as we traveled, and eventually I could see they were neither in the sky nor on the ground, but were coming from several structures. I realized this was where the wagon was destined, and fear knotted my stomach again. Finally, we stopped in front of one of the structures. It was unlike any teepee I had ever seen, at least 3 times as high and shaped like a box. We had arrived at the school. The man and woman climbed down from the wagon and motioned me to follow. "No, no," I cried, trembling. What was left of my courage fled. I gripped the sides of the wagon tightly. The man and woman just stood watching me. An opening appeared in the structure, and a different white woman emerged. She, too, had pale skin and wore a long black dress, but had no headdress. She spoke to the other 2 and then came to me. Gently, she put one hand over mine, speaking quiet words I couldn't understand. Even though they were chopped words of the Whites, they were words of softness and reminded me of the way my aunt used to comfort me when I was frightened. The woman smiled, and I allowed her to pull my hand away from my side and help me out of the wagon. I followed her through an opening in the tall structure. Once inside, I stopped, unable to keep walking. The space was open like a teepee, but it looked as if it were made of wood instead of buffalo skins. There were no sleeping skins or cooking fires, nothing to show that anyone had lived here. It wasn't round like soft like a teepee, but it was hard and rough in places. Above me was wood. When I looked up, I couldn't see a flap at the top for a cooking fire, just a long flat surface. The woman tugged my hand to follow, but I was frozen by fear. I shook my head no. She ignored this and pulled me towards a smaller, narrow space where there were long pieces of wood stacked on top of one on another. It looked as if they went up the wall. Dropping my hand, the woman began to climb the wooden pieces. Then she turned and motioned for me to follow as she disappeared behind the wall. I was sure this was some sort of white man's magic, and I stopped for a moment, but I was terrified of being left alone, so I hurried to follow her. As I climbed to the top, I discovered a long space. The woman walked through this space and into the room. I peeked in to see a room of sleeping spaces in 2 neat rows. Each sleeping space stood above the floor on small wooden sticks that kept it propped up high. There were no skins rolled out on the floor. Did the whites sleep off the ground? The woman led me to one that had clothing laid across it and showed me that she wanted me to dress in this clothing. I picked up something that looked like a white dress and rubbed it between my fingers. It felt rough and coarse, nothing like the clothing mother had sewn from deer hide. This dress looked too long and too large. I shook my head no. The woman frowned, murmuring white words, then abruptly turned and left me standing alone in the room. I continued to stand there, unsure of what to do next. For the first time in my life, I was away from my Teo spa, away from everything I knew, everyone who cared about me. I looked around for something familiar, but everything I saw felt wrong. The sleeping spaces were up off the ground and covered with blankets instead of skins. The walls were made of wood instead of buffalo hide. The floor was made of wood instead of earth, and I knew I was standing on a place that was stacked up on top of another place. I had never been in a teepee that had one open space stacked upon another. On a wall, I could see a picture of a man hanging from 2 pieces of crossed wood. His hand had been pierced and attached to the wood, and his face was filled with agony. Clearly he had been injured. Was this meant as a warning to me? Suddenly exhausted, I slid to the floor, not trusting that I would be safe sitting on the sleeping space when it was so high above the ground. I heard footsteps and voices, and I stood as girls walked into the room. Each wore a dress similar to the woman's, except the dresses were blue and pink and yellow instead of black. Each girl neatly had trimmed hair, and they were speaking in the strange clipped words of the white. At first I thought they were white girls, but their skin was the same color as mine, and I realized they were Lakota like me. The girls stared at me as they walked by and stood in the middle of the room, staring back at them. A different white woman had come behind them and stood smiling at me, but I remained in my place, still unsure of what I was supposed to do. Finally, one of the girls came to me and led me to a sleeping space, whispering quietly in Lakota. "It is night time. We say prayers and sleep. Watch and do the same." The white woman cleared her throat, and all the girls went to a sleeping space and knelt beside it, pressing their hands together. "Do the same," repeated the girl, pulling me down to my knees. The woman spoke words, and the girl spoke the same words. Then everyone changed into the same kind of dress that had been laid out for me. I realized the clothing on my sleeping space was meant to be night clothes. But why couldn't I sleep in the clothes I had brought with me? Clothes that were comfortable and familiar. I threw the ugly white dress off my sleeping space and lay down on top, feeling dizzy with anger and confusion. The woman came to me and frowned, picking up the night dress from the floor and folding it neatly and placing it at the bottom of my sleeping space. Then she sat next to me and stroked my forehead. I closed my eyes and swallowed hard. Her touch was kind and gentle, and I could feel myself close to tears, but I would not show weakness by crying. I bit the inside of my cheek and turned away from her until she stood and left. After she was gone, I kicked the dress off the sleeping space once again. Someone blew out the lanterns, and the room fell into darkness. I lay on top of my sleeping space, still in the clothing in which I had come, staring through the small space in the wall where I could see outside. A few lonely stars stared back through the blackness. "My name is Waxtall," I hear a whisper from the sleeping space next to mine. "It will get easier," she said. I traced the outline of the small rabbit bear had carved for me. Loneliness pushed down on me like a heavy blanket, and finally I let the tears come. "Where's your courage now?" I could only imagine Cousin saying. I desperately wished she was next to me, still alive. "Here it is, Cousin, right here," I whispered, trying to stop the tears, trying to find the courage that I was afraid had disappeared forever.